So just a few questions before I get started. How many people here are from British Columbia? If you could raise your hands. Sorry? The mic's just for the video, I think. Doesn't make me louder. Can you hear me back there? Okay. So sorry, how many people are from British Columbia, if you can raise your hand? Okay, and how many people have heard of the Environmental Assessment Office? Okay, so that's actually a lot. And do you know what they do? If you could raise your hand again. A little bit. Okay. So what does this office do? Well, they're a branch of the Ministry of Environment, and they're responsible for reviewing and approving. Shift. Is that good? Okay. They're responsible for reviewing and approving most large projects in BC, as legislated by the BC Environmental Assessment Act. Whether a project triggers an environmental assessment is determined by various factors depending on the industry. So for mines, it's the production rate. For electric transmission lines, it's the length of the project, to give you a few examples. Once a project is approved, it receives an environmental assessment certificate, and this contains the list of legally binding conditions to which the proponent must adhere to as development progresses. So why did I choose to focus specifically on regulatory oversight by the Environmental Assessment Office and not a different regulatory agency? Well, in 2011, the Auditor General found that this office could not assure British Columbians that mitigation efforts were having their intended effects because adequate monitoring was not occurring and follow-up evaluations were not being conducted. It was also found that any information being provided to the public was not sufficient to ensure accountability. And this is largely still the case, but it's slowly changing. In response to this, the office implemented a compliance and enforcement task force to review newly required self-reports, similar to voluntary disclosure, and to conduct inspections. And the first inspection was conducted in 2011. This image from the Auditor General report shows why compliance and enforcement, specifically about environmental assessment, is necessary, as it provides that feedback loop for improvement to environmental assessment practice for the benefit of future projects. Not to mention it helps measure how well we're actually protecting our environment. Although the merits of environmental assessment follow-up have been discussed at length in the literature since at least the 1980s, there's little, if any, of follow-up done in practice today. There are some exceptions, typically for projects of greater size or uncertainty. Some of you may have heard of the Diavik diamond mine in the Northwest Territories. That's one. But I haven't been able to identify a specific jurisdiction that does follow up consistently. The Environmental Assessment Act is important. However, it's just one piece of legislation which applies to projects in BC. And overall, environmental regulation here is pretty confusing for both regulators and proponents, with a lot of overlap. And the purpose of this chart is to highlight various different environmental legislation, which is in the left column, and the government agency primarily responsible, which is in the middle, and I've color-coded that. The far right shows how many different agencies and legislation are typically relevant for a pipeline project. As you may have noticed on the previous slide, after environmental assessment comes a process called permitting. And the agencies listed in this table are often involved in both the environmental assessment process, which is led by the Environmental Assessment Office, and then the subsequent permitting phase. To make matters more confusing, in BC, many environmental assessment certificate conditions are intrinsically related to this other environmental protection legislation, such as the Wildlife Act. And some can be redundant when considered alongside permit requirements. And in fact, whichever the stricter requirement is what is legally binding. And this is contrary to the intuitive belief of some proponents that it's the most recent approval to which they're bound. Permit requirements are usually enforced by the primary agency. So agencies such as the Oil and Gas Commission and the Ministry of Environment do keep track of inspections and fines. And some of this data is available online in spreadsheets or in reports. There are ongoing issues, however, surrounding data sharing between agencies. So this table is not exhaustive, but I think it provides a good picture of the regulatory environment, and I haven't included regional or municipal regulations. I did have to break it up so that you could read it. So this slide has the federal regulations, and although I have included these federal agencies and the Canadian Environmental Assessment Agency, Canada delegates many environmental approval and enforcement activities to the provinces. And in the case of environmental assessment, especially since the latest revision of the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act in 2012, this has never been more true. And this is another reason I decided to focus in on the Environmental Assessment Office. Evaluating the office's patterns of enforcement and associated compliance rates is a step towards ensuring that enforcement actions are effective in deterring noncompliance and understanding the patterns and factors contributing to compliance outcomes, both good and bad. Before I get into the data, it's useful to understand what an environmental assessment certificate inspection is and what it isn't. So on the slide it says EAC inspections for short. So these inspections are what the literature on EA follow-up calls implementation audits, and they evaluate the degree to which conditions and mitigations are being applied and whether they're operating as intended. Project impact audits examine the broad impacts of a project from operation and construction. Inspections by the Environmental Assessment Office sometimes include the inspector's opinion about what aspects of the environment have been affected. Going a step further are predictive technique audits, which compare the actual impacts with the predicted impacts. And this is currently not being done in BC as far as I know. Although it's helpful to separate and classify these follow-up activities, researchers have argued that these audits are inextricably linked. And I believe that EAC inspections and self-reports have the potential to cover off all three audits if a consistent method of data collection and reporting is employed. Unfortunately for me, data on the Environmental Assessment Office's enforcement activities and compliance information is not published online, nor is it contained in any sort of database. It's all in PDF format. The public can obtain these inspection reports through a formal Freedom of Information request. I was lucky enough not to have to go through this process. So all of the graphs and metrics I'll mention today were previously not available or calculable. I don't believe industry or the government is really aware of these numbers. I've collected data that there are 101 active projects in BC. So I define active as projects that were approved through the BC environmental assessment process and have been in construction, operation, or decommissioning at some point between 2011 and 2015. During this time frame, there have been 94 inspections conducted on 42 projects. Of the 42 projects that received at least one inspection, the majority were run-of-river projects, mines, wind farms, and landfills. 15 inspections of the 94 have still not been fully released to me, and this is because of ongoing negotiations between the proponent and the Environmental Assessment Office about the interpretation and findings in these reports. This table shows the number of inspections conducted each year since 2011. And the first ever environmental assessment certificate inspection was conducted in August. So those 7 inspections were over a 4-month period, not 12 for 2011. Also for 2015, that doesn't include the month of December. But there have only been about 4 inspections in that whole time frame from 2011 to now conducted in December. So I think 16 to 18 will be the final count. And I'm not sure why the number has dropped off by nearly 40%. Below are the risk-based criteria cited by the office as the primary means for determining whether a project should receive an inspection in a given year or not. Potential risk, this is with regards to the 5 pillars of environmental assessment, so environmental, economic, social, heritage, and health values. The project phase, with projects in construction being prioritized over those in operation. The compliance record, this is based on previous inspection findings about non-compliances and awareness of regulations. And the time of year project schedule, the goal being to inspect projects during higher risk natural seasonal events such as spring thaw, or during higher risk project activities, typically during construction such as clearing. So this graph, which I'll bring up fully in a second, depicts the fraction of projects that have been inspected or not for each project category along the y-axis. The bracketed number next to the project category is the total number of inspections conducted on projects in that category. So I'd like you to think about which categories you perceive as more risky and possibly more likely to have been inspected. So the purple bar here represents the fraction in reality of projects that have been inspected. So 100% of wind farms that have been through the environmental assessment process have been inspected by the Environmental Assessment Office. but only 15% of gas plants and pipelines. Do you think wind farms are more risky than gas plants and pipelines? What factors besides those listed in the previous slide might be influencing regulator decisions about what projects to inspect? So I'll get into more of that later. And the orange portion, of course, is the percent of projects that have yet to be inspected at all. It's important to remember that certain categories of projects, such as mines and pipelines, may be inspected for compliance by other agencies, such as the Oil and Gas Commission or the Ministry of Energy and Mines. When a non-compliance is confirmed through an inspection, the office has a set of escalatory responses to choose from depending on the severity of the infraction and the perceived likelihood that the proponent will or will not correct the issue voluntarily. The least significant response is an advisory, simply letting the proponent know they're out of compliance with a particular condition or conditions. A warning warns of escalatory enforcement actions should the non-compliance continue. An order can also be issued to cease or remedy, and there's also a fourth possibility which can be entered into voluntarily by the proponent, and this is a compliance agreement, which is used in cases where the proponent is willing and able to achieve compliance and where a structured approach to issue resolution has been determined to be most appropriate. There are also judicial enforcement measures which include monetary penalties, and so far no monetary penalties or any of these measures have been handed out. These penalties can include fines up to a maximum of $200,000 or potentially prison time. The total enforcement responses in this table don't equal 94, which is the total number of inspections, because in a few cases more than one response has been given out. And not specified means that nothing was written on the inspection form as to one of these possible responses, even though there was non-compliances noted. In this chart, the blue bars represent the rate of compliance, so the ratio of inspections that reported 0 non-compliances. And the gray is the percent of inspections that year that are still unreleased. As you can see, the rate of compliance has increased and then decreased when not considering these unreleased inspections. And overall, the rate is 34%. This pattern could be because of targeted enforcement strategies, with operations having a history of non-compliance being targeted by regulators and receiving more enforcement activities. This, I know, is definitely true for specific projects. I've also included the actual number of unreleased inspections at the top of each gray bar. So even if all those 9 inspections from 2015 were in compliance, the rate would be as good as 2013. And for 2014, if all those unreleased inspections were in compliance, the rate would be 45%. I do think it extremely unlikely that all of these reports are in compliance, however, given the reason why these inspections are still unreleased and the few that have begun trickling in. Besides data from the inspection reports, I've also collected data from other sources, including the Environmental Assessment Office's website, which has a wealth of information, although again not organized very well or easily retrieved, and the BC Legislative Assembly or Hansard website. Using the database, there are a variety of tests I would like to carry out, and some of them I've started. Are inspections conducted according to the risk-based criteria? Well, some criteria is easier to test than others. For example, the criteria of prioritizing construction does appear to be followed in practice, with 69% of inspections occurring during the construction phase. On the next few slides, I'll present some preliminary findings on whether older projects have been given a pass, whether projects that receive more public attention might attract inspections, and whether projects that submit regular self-reports are inspected more or less often. I'm also interested in whether projects that submit regular self-reports have better or worse compliance histories. This is something I have still yet to analyze. So the light gray bullets are further tests I plan to do as part of my research. One question that is particularly interesting to me is whether there are any patterns to non-compliance in terms of the types of conditions in non-compliance. So for example, I might ask whether run-of-river projects are most commonly in non-compliance with conditions relating to sediment and erosion control. Are older projects given a pass? Well, not surprisingly, 85% of inspected projects are projects that were approved after 2002. Also, these projects are more likely to be in construction. All projects approved before 2002 only have project approval certificates. So some of these projects contain, separate from the certificate, a table of proponent commitments, but this isn't true for all projects. And also projects approved prior to 2002 contain grandfathered projects. So these are projects that were approved before 1995 when the Environmental Assessment Act first came into force. And these projects don't have any approval or compliance documentation online. And the reason this adds up to 102 projects instead of 101 is that one inspected project was not actually active by my earlier definition. And this project started construction before receiving an environmental assessment approval and has since stopped. So looking at the data overall, inspected projects have approximately 3 times as many conditions on average than projects that were not inspected. So I've included the number of conditions for projects approved after 2002, but I've also included the number of conditions for those projects that were approved before 2002 that have that table of conditions. Inspected projects also received more public attention on average than projects that did not receive inspections, and they submitted more compliance self-reports on average. So that's really all the time I have for today, and I thank you for listening. I'd like to thank Hadi, my supervisor here at IRES, for his support, Archie, who is also on my research committee, for inspiring me to start research on this topic, and the Environmental Assessment Office for their responsiveness, and they've actually offered to QA/QC all my data, which hopefully they're almost finished, and they provided context and expert knowledge. So thank you. That's all. Mm-hmm.
Have you come across other jurisdictions that have a solid process in place, someone who can actually reference to say, this is the kind of thing that needs to be should be?
There definitely is, and it's more related to permit requirements. And in BC, there is a more consistent way of documenting that. Specifically, though, for environmental assessment, I haven't found much data. But the USA is an example. They have lots of data on their compliance and enforcement. And BC has some, and it is available online, which is good, because none of this is. Yeah.
Thanks. Did you think about, or did you look at the relationship between inspections and what their significance determinations do? Or is that kind of buried in the conditions? So if you had a significant adverse effects determination that report in the inspection?
So you mean in the application?
The application.
I haven't looked at that. That could be another. Well, the conditions are, you would expect a project that has more potential significant effects to have conditions related to that. Whether that's true, I haven't looked at. Yeah. Yeah.
Staff budget.
Mm-hmm. How many staff? Well, it was, I don't think there was really anyone doing it before 2011. And then I think they had about 4 or 5 people then. And I think it has increased somewhat, but not enough until now. And the budget, I mean, it's probably not enough, but I haven't looked deeply into that. And that is something I can ask the woman at the Environmental Assessment Office.
I was wondering,
Mm-hmm.
what would be the recommendations for insight in terms of how these assessment processes might be
Well, the assessment process itself, that's another can of worms, I guess. The compliance process, yes. Well, I think some of these inspection reports are handwritten, some of them are typed, and they're really not consistent at all. And the Environmental Assessment Office is developing a new way of doing this right now, so I'm hoping I'll be able to see that before I wrap up my thesis. But the main thing, I think, is making sure the public can see what's going on. And right now there's some projects that have certain reports published online when there's a compliance agreement. This is only 2 projects right now, but for the most part, no inspections are published. I think this is going to change, and they're going to be posting all historical inspections, but again, they're in PDF form, so it's not really useful. They really need to, I'm hoping they'll use my data if they find it's accurate, and they can figure out how to improve the way they're already doing things.